The first wrong thing in Martin Feld's conference room wasn't the missing seat card. It was Arthur Wren's blue willow teacup, the one with the repaired handle, sitting in front of Celeste, as if she had always owned it. My name is Mara Ellis Wren. I was 34 that morning, 10 months widowed, and my mother-in-law was already telling the room that I had married her son Julian for money. She said it softly, almost elegantly, while smoothing the cuff of her black cashmere dress, but she said it loudly enough for Arthur's sister, two cousins, and Sloane to hear. My chair had been placed against the wall instead of at the mahogany table where the estate folders were lined up in neat cream stacks. There was a yellow sticky note on my packet that read guest copy. I remember thinking, with a kind of cold clarity that made my skin prickle, that nobody moves a widow's chair by accident. And before that meeting was over, one question from the estate attorney was going to make it impossible for Celeste to keep pretending I was the one who had come into that family looking for something to take. If you've ever ignored the first wrong detail because the room belonged to family, keep listening. I did that for far too long, and by the time I stopped explaining their behavior away, they had built an entire story around my silence. The reason that teacup mattered is because I had glued its handle back together myself 2 years earlier. Arthur had knocked it off the breakfast tray one rainy Tuesday in March, back when his hands were getting unreliable, and nobody in the family wanted to say the word Parkinson's out loud. The handle split into two clean pieces, and Celeste had made the kind of face people make at restaurant glasses with lipstick marks on them. She had said, "Well, that's finished," and started to sweep the pieces aside. Arthur told her not to. I took the pieces home in a Ziploc bag, bought food-safe adhesive from a hardware store on Forest Avenue, and spent 40 minutes lining the edge up exactly right under my kitchen light. When I brought it back the next morning, Arthur ran one finger over the seam, smiled, and said, "Funny, still holds tea." That was the first time he looked at me as if he saw something useful that had nothing to do with Julian. Celeste, on the other hand, had been assessing me from the beginning as if usefulness itself were suspicious. I met Julian 3.5 years before the estate meeting, at a fundraising breakfast for the children's wing at St. Anne's Hospital. I worked in grants accounting there, which sounds more glamorous than it is. Mostly, it meant I knew how to build spreadsheets nobody appreciated until something broke. Julian was there because his firm had donated design hours for a family waiting room renovation. He was tall in an unstudied way, with tired brown eyes and a navy tie that had a coffee stain just below the knot. When he found out I had spent 15 minutes trying to quietly fix the registration list after a donor's assistant had swapped name tags, he laughed and said, "You look like someone who saves disasters without announcing it." It was such an odd, exact thing to say that I remembered it. Julian came from the kind of Richmond family people described with a lowered voice, like they were naming a school or a law firm. The Wrens had buildings with their last name on the bronze directories downtown. Not skyscrapers, not movie star wealth, but old local money, the kind tied up in partnerships, trusts, land, and stories people kept alive longer than the facts. Their house sat on 6 acres just outside the city line, a red brick Georgian with white columns, a carriage house, and boxwoods clipped into obedience. The first time Julian drove me there, I remember checking the hem of my dress twice in the car because the place looked like it expected women to arrive, already polished. My side of life looked different. I grew up in Mechanicsville with a mother who balanced 3 jobs without ever calling herself tired, and a father who fixed HVAC systems until his knees failed him. I went to community college first because it was what we could afford. I bought my own one-bedroom condo at 28. I knew exactly what a late fee cost, exactly how much interest built between the minimum payment and the truth. I had savings because I had built them slowly, with habits instead of magic. None of that read as impressive to Celeste. To her, I was the woman from the wrong side of the dinner table who had somehow ended up dating her son. She never said anything vulgar at first. She was too trained for that. Her cruelty liked a better blouse. At our third dinner in the main house, she asked me, smiling over the rim of a wineglass, whether I found the Wren property a lot to take in. It sounded friendly until she added, "Some people get dazzled by square footage." Julian squeezed my knee under the table hard enough for me to know he heard it too. I said, "I grew up with 5 people in 1,100 square feet. I notice plumbing before I notice grandeur." Arthur laughed so suddenly that iced tea came out his nose. That should have told me 2 things much earlier than it did. First, that Arthur had spent years watching Celeste perform refinement to people who were too intimidated to name it, and second, that Julian's instinct when his mother crossed a line was to press my knee under the table and ask me later to let it go. That pattern cost us both more than he understood. When Julian proposed, he did it in my condo kitchen while we were eating takeout Thai from the cartons because the power had flickered in a storm and we had candles lit anyway. He slid the ring box across the counter next to the soy sauce packets and said, "I know this is not what my mother thinks a proposal is supposed to look like, which is precisely why I want it to be this." The ring was an oval diamond in a plain gold setting that he had chosen himself. No speech. No photographer in a hedge. Just him, rain at the window, and my dish towel still over my shoulder. I said yes before he finished the question. Celeste's first response when she saw the ring was to take my left hand and turn it toward the light as if she were pricing a horse. Then she smiled and said, "Lovely. Sensible size. Sensible size." I heard that phrase in my head for months. It sat in the same cabinet as her other favorites. Tasteful, practical, straightforward, not really our way. She could insult you with words that sounded like compliments to anyone not listening carefully. A week after the engagement, a prenuptial agreement arrived by courier at my office in a cream envelope, embossed with a return address from a law firm on Franklin Street. Not even from Julian, from a lawyer. I sat at my desk, staring at that envelope while the copier hummed, and one of the nurses argued with pharmacy on speakerphone about a missing authorization. I still remember the date on the cover letter. September 14. Julian was mortified. He showed up at my condo that night with grocery store roses and a face that looked 10 years older than it had that morning. He said he hadn't known Celeste would move that fast, and that his father thought it was standard family housekeeping. I told him I wasn't offended by the document. I was offended by the delivery system. Then I did what I always do. I had it reviewed. My attorney, a woman named Cynthia who charged $350 an hour and had the dry patience of someone who had seen richer people behave worse, walked me through it, line by line. The truth beneath all the family mythology was almost funny. Julian did not actually have much liquid money in his own name. He had an interest in his architecture and restoration firm, a retirement account, a used Volvo, and a modest brokerage account Arthur had started when he was 25. The real wealth sat higher up in Arthur's structures and trusts. The prenup mostly protected future inheritances and family holdings that were never mine to touch unless someone specifically left them to us. When I signed it, I did it because I loved Julian and because the paper confirmed something I had already sensed. Celeste was guarding an image more aggressively than an actual risk. That should have unsettled me more than it did. Instead, I made the mistake a lot of calm women make. I mistook my ability to endure discomfort for evidence that it wasn't dangerous. The wedding itself was beautiful if you only looked where Celeste wanted you to look. White flowers in low bowls, a quartet near the fountain, heavy ivory paper with our names engraved so deeply you could feel the impression if you ran your thumb over the letters. There was a seating issue at the rehearsal dinner that Celeste explained away as pure logistics, which is how my parents ended up beside the service door, while the senior partners from Wren Properties sat in the center of the room. My mother noticed. She just chose not to embarrass me by saying so then. Later that night, as I was carrying a tray of empty champagne flutes back toward the bar, because apparently I could not stop helping even at my own wedding weekend, Arthur stopped me and pointed to the blue willow teacup on the buffet. "That one's older than the marriage," he said. I smiled, not understanding. He tapped the table with his forefinger. If it cracks, don't let my wife throw it out. At the time, I thought he was just being odd, in the way older men are sometimes allowed to be, when they've spent decades in houses where everyone edits themselves around them. Now I know Arthur had already learned how value got decided in his home. For the first year of our marriage, Julian and I lived mostly in my condo because it was closer to both our offices, and because neither of us wanted the gravitational pull of his family place. He was not his mother, I need to say that clearly. He was conflict avoidant in ways that became expensive later, but he was kind, observant, and deeply human. He brought home bruised peaches from the Saturday market because he felt bad for produce no one else wanted. He called my mother just to ask how her shoulder surgery was healing. He once drove 40 minutes at 10:30 at night because my downstairs neighbor's teenager had locked herself out and I had mentioned it in passing. I did not marry a trust fund. I married a man who had been raised near money and spent a good part of his adult life trying not to become hard because of it. What I did not fully understand until after our first anniversary was how little distance there really was between Julian and the Wren financial machine. His firm restored older commercial properties, including several held by side partnerships connected to Arthur's network. It made Julian look more independent than he actually was. If one project stalled, Arthur could quietly bridge a gap. If a lender hesitated, a family contact made a call. Nothing illegal, just the kind of invisible cushion that people born into networks mistake for personal merit. And because Julian knew that, he carried around a specific kind of shame about taking help. That shame is part of why Celeste thought she could get away with what she later said about me. She knew her son would rather look successful than explain how often his soft landings had been arranged by other people. The first time I put money into Julian's life, I didn't tell anyone except him. In June, after a condo unit 2 floors above mine sold at a number I couldn't ignore, I listed mine. The market was still hot enough that I cleared more than I expected after closing costs. $96,318. Julian and I had been talking about buying somewhere together eventually, but his firm had hit a sudden cash flow crunch after a developer delayed payment on 2 completed invoices, and one partner had made an ugly bookkeeping mess that turned a payroll week into a panic. Not fraud, not theft, just incompetence with consequences. Julian sat at our kitchen table at 1 in the morning with both hands over his face and said, "If I miss payroll, 8 people pay for my pride." So I wired $48,000 into Wren and Burke on June 21 at 9:14 a.m. I still remember the wire confirmation number because I printed it, wrote payroll bridge in the margin, and slid it into a file folder. Julian cried when he saw the transfer clear. He said he would pay me back within 6 months. I told him marriage was not a collections agency. That line would come back to me later in a way I wish it hadn't. The rest of the condo proceeds went into our joint savings and a high-yield account we both had access to. We were planning like adults, carefully, boringly. It felt solid, and if anyone had asked then who was carrying whom, the answer would not have matched the story Celeste later sold. But nobody asked then because I kept my mouth shut. I had been in the Wren orbit long enough by that point to hear Celeste's phrase, every time there was work to assign and a thank you to avoid. We take care of our own. She said it when Arthur had a medication review and wanted someone to sit with him at St. Mary's because he got agitated in waiting rooms. We take care of our own. She said it when Sloane needed last-minute childcare for a school holiday because her husband Brent had a golf event, and she had already committed to the museum board luncheon. We take care of our own. She said it when Julian suggested we skip Easter brunch because we both had the flu, and somehow it ended with me making deviled eggs on 3 hours of sleep because Arthur would be disappointed. It took me too long to understand that in Celeste's mouth, our own meant whoever would still show up without requiring respect first. Arthur's health turned the phrase into a system. His Parkinson's became undeniable the winter after we married. He started shuffling more than walking. Buttons took longer. He had one frightening episode in the breakfast room where he froze in place halfway to the table and could not make his right foot move for almost 20 seconds. Celeste rang for the housekeeper like the problem was a spilled tray. Julian and I got him into a chair. I remember his fingers trembling against my wrist while he pretended not to notice Sloane crying. After that came specialists, scans, physical therapy, home modifications, medication changes, insurance fights, and the ugly administrative churn illness brings into houses that like to think they are above it. Because I worked in hospital finance and knew how to read authorizations, prior approvals, deductible schedules, and denial codes without blinking, I became useful very quickly. At first, it was just, Mara, you're so good with forms. Then it was, Mara, could you call the neurologist's office? They actually answer when you speak to them. Then it was, Mara, could you make a spreadsheet of his dosing times? Everything is getting so complicated. Then it was my phone number on the pharmacy alerts, my email on the home health portal, my handwriting on the refrigerator dry erase board that listed blood pressure readings, mobility exercises, and who had last checked the bedside commode supplies. The people at the medical equipment company started assuming I was Arthur's daughter. Celeste never corrected them when it helped. She corrected them immediately when it didn't. One afternoon at a movement disorder appointment, the nurse practitioner asked whether Arthur's daughter could sign a home safety release. Celeste put her pearls back into place with one hand and said, without looking at me, she's not his daughter. She's Julian's wife. It was such a clean, efficient reduction that I felt it like a thumb pressed into a bruise. Then she handed me the clipboard anyway because she didn't have her reading glasses. That was the texture of life with her. Diminish. Delegate smile. Arthur noticed more than he said. He had the old world male habit of observing from behind a newspaper until the room forgot he was there, but illness made him clearer, not foggier. He started asking who had paid for what, not in a suspicious way, in the exacting way of a man who had spent 40 years signing off on invoices and knew that gratitude without numbers gets rewritten. When the contractor came to quote the downstairs accessible shower conversion and stair lift for the back hall, Celeste said it was all getting impossibly expensive. Julian and I were standing in the mudroom when she said it, looking at a typed estimate clipped to a yellow pad. $18,640. Arthur needed it, that should have ended the discussion. Instead, Celeste asked if we really needed the more premium finish selections, as if slip resistance were a luxury aesthetic. Julian looked exhausted. He had a deadline. Sloane had already left because the sound of pricing discussions made her feel ill. Arthur was asleep in the den after a rough morning. So I said I would front the contractor deposit and we could sort reimbursement when Arthur's quarterly distributions hit. Celeste said, "You're generous, Mara. We take care of our own." She never said thank you. I paid the deposit on my Visa at 3:42 that afternoon. I still have the email receipt from Carter Mobility and Bath Solutions. That became the rhythm. I would cover something because there was urgency, and Celeste would turn necessity into a test of character, a $1,200 medication bridge, because the specialty pharmacy delayed shipment. I paid it. $3,200 for a temporary nighttime aid after Arthur hallucinated and tried to leave through the back door at 2 in the morning? I paid the deposit. 4 months of ramp-up scheduling with Brightwatch Home Care because every agency wanted the first week secured before they assigned consistent staff. My card again. Sometimes Julian reimbursed portions when a project check came through. Sometimes Arthur wrote me a personal check. Sometimes nothing happened except a verbal assurance that it will all be settled. And because I kept records for a living, I saved every invoice, screenshot, and transfer confirmation without making a speech about it. If I had been louder, maybe Celeste would have taken me more seriously. Then again, if I had been louder, she might have moved sooner. The uglier truth is that the smaller betrayals were easier to dismiss than the big ones because they arrived disguised as stress. If Celeste forgot to include me in the family group text, Maybe it was habit. If she posted a photo of Arthur's birthday lunch on Facebook and wrote grateful for family, without mentioning the person who had ordered the catering, coordinated the wheelchair accessible van, and spent the night before labeling his medication organizer, maybe she was just distracted. If she introduced me to visiting relatives as Julian's wife, Mara, after 3 years of marriage instead of simply Mara, maybe I was being oversensitive. If Sloane forwarded me a grocery list for Arthur without a greeting and then posted a picture from a spa in Charlottesville, maybe she was drowning in her own life too. That is how rot works in families like theirs. Not with one spectacular blow at first, with a series of deniable cuts that leave you explaining your own bleeding. The person who made that hardest to admit was Julian, not because he agreed with Celeste. He didn't. He would apologize in the car, in bed, in the kitchen while unloading groceries. He would say, "She's impossible," or I know," or "You didn't deserve that." He meant it every time, but he also kept hoping the next dinner, the next holiday, the next medical scare, the next property closing would somehow teach his mother gratitude. He thought competence would eventually be recognized because he was still carrying the child's version of his family, the one where effort counted if people saw enough of it. I had already learned that some people can watch you hold up their ceiling and still call you lucky to be indoors. We fought about it exactly twice. The first time was after Thanksgiving, when Celeste asked me to help plate dessert, and then gave a toast in the dining room thanking the family members who keep showing up in difficult seasons. She looked directly at Sloane and Brent, not at me, not at Julian either, actually, which told me the performance mattered more than the accuracy. When we got home, I stood in our kitchen, still in my wool dress, and said, "Your mother likes my labor more than my presence." Julian leaned both palms against the counter and closed his eyes. "I know," he said. "That's not an answer. No, it's not, but it's the only one I keep getting." He came around the island, put his forehead against mine, and said, "Just give me a little more time with them. Dad's getting worse. Everything feels like it's being held together with tape." That sentence broke me more than a harsher one would have, because it was so nakedly true. We were all holding things together with tape by then. The second fight happened after Celeste asked me, in front of two of Arthur's golf friends, whether I planned to keep working once family obligations increase. She said it in the tone of someone discussing weather patterns, but I heard what sat underneath it. A woman like me should be grateful enough to become available. Julian actually snapped at her that time. "Mara's job is not optional because yours has always been social." The room went silent. Arthur looked at his plate. Sloane stared into her wine. Celeste smiled the way people do when they decide to remember a humiliation for later use. On the drive home, I told Julian he had just made me more dangerous to her. He said, "Maybe she needs that." What he did not understand is that people like Celeste don't become better when they feel exposed. They become strategic. Julian died on February 3, 3 days after his 37th birthday. I can tell you the exact time the state trooper knocked because my microwave still read 4:18 when I stumbled into the kitchen afterward and realized I was holding my own elbow so hard it hurt. Black ice on Route 64. He had gone out before dawn to look at a roofline failure at one of the old warehouse conversions because a tenant reported leaking near the truss work, and he thought if he handled it himself, he could salvage a relationship with the client. There was nothing cinematic about losing him. No final words, no hospital scene where I got to say I understood the unfinished parts. Just paperwork, shock, and the obscene practicalities that arrive before grief has even sat down. At the funeral home, while I was choosing a navy tie from the options they laid out in velvet trays, because apparently even death needs accessories, Celeste asked whether Julian had kept the life policy information organized. I looked at her because I thought I must have heard wrong. She touched my wrist and said, "Not for me, darling. We just need clarity." Clarity, that word should come with a warning label in rooms where money and mourning meet. The policy was $250,000. That sounds like an enormous amount, until you subtract a business line Julian had personally guaranteed, the taxes triggered by certain liquidations in the firm after his death, and the remaining obligations we had both agreed to cover for Arthur's care because nobody else was actually doing the math. By the time the dust settled, there was no widow's jackpot. There was a narrower runway and a longer list. Celeste told people I had come into money anyway. I know because one of Arthur's cousins, after too much white wine at the memorial lunch, squeezed my shoulder and said, "At least Julian made sure you'd be comfortable." Comfortable. That night, I sat on the bathroom floor and laughed so hard I scared myself. A month after Julian died, I found out Celeste had been telling friends at her club that I would probably move on quickly now that I had security. The source was a woman named Patricia who believed she was being kind by warning me what was being said. She delivered the information with the tone people use when they think the truth, once shared, is somehow medicinal. I thanked her and went back to work. Arthur started declining faster after Julian's death, as though grief had reached into his spine and pulled one more thread loose. He began sundowning some evenings, wandering mentally and physically. He forgot whether he had taken his afternoon dose. He woke twice convinced Julian was in the workshop. He had a fall in the downstairs powder room in April that scared everyone badly enough that no one could pretend anymore. That was when Celeste asked if I would move into the carriage house for a little while, just until things stabilized, just until we got proper round-the-clock support in place, just until Arthur stopped asking for me at night. The carriage house sat behind the main house and had once been used for guests. Brick floor in the mudroom, sloped ceilings upstairs, old windows that leaked cold in winter. Julian and I had talked once about renovating it into a studio apartment for ourselves if Arthur ever sold the main property. Instead, I moved in alone with 2 suitcases, my laptop, Arthur's medication chart, and a grief that had started to feel less like crying and more like losing blood somewhere no one could see. Celeste stood in the doorway while Brent carried one of my plastic storage bins inside. She gave me a key on a navy ribbon and said, "This is what family does, Mara. We take care of our own." What I should have heard had been, "We know you will confuse being needed with being wanted." Those months in the carriage house changed my understanding of almost everything, because once I was close enough to the machinery, I could see who was actually turning the gears. Sloane visited Arthur for exactly 42 minutes on Mother's Day and spent 12 of them taking photos on the back terrace because the peonies were out. Brent handled business matters, which mostly meant he had opinions about staffing costs, without once sitting through a 2 a.m. agitation spell. Celeste remained impressive at lunch. She wore cream linen, kept up her board memberships, took calls in the garden with the low, controlled voice of a woman who believes her public usefulness offsets her private absences. She loved to step in at the visible moments, greeting the home health nurse, signing flowers into the funeral guest book after one of Arthur's friends died, sitting in the first chair during consultations. Then she would drift upstairs or out to an event and leave the practical wreckage in my lap. Meanwhile, I was the one who cleaned vomit from the bath mat after a medication side effect. I was the one who learned how Arthur liked his compression socks rolled so the seam didn't dig into his calf. I was the one who knew the exact angle at which the den curtains needed to be closed in late afternoon because sharp light made him more confused. I paid Brightwatch's weekend differential the first 2 times because their invoices came due before Arthur's trust distribution released. Celeste emailed me on May 16 at 8:07 a.m. "Can you cover this cycle? Martin says liquidity is tight until the bond redemption clears. We'll settle with you from Arthur's side once accounts normalize." I flagged the email and paid the invoice, then I paid another on June 2 and another on June 28. By July, I had a folder on my desktop labeled Arthur Care with subfolders for aids, pharmacy, equipment, home modifications, and reimbursements pending. I was not planning for war. I was planning for order. The distinction matters. One night in late July, Arthur was having tea in the breakfast room after a decent day. His tremor was milder when he was less tired, and he had a small run of these sharper evenings where the old man came back almost intact. He pointed at the blue willow teacup in my hand, the repaired one, and said, "You kept that. You told me not to let it go." He nodded once. "Do the same with paper." I looked at him. He reached for the legal pad beside his plate and wrote, with the slow concentration his hand now required, "Keep every receipt." Then he slid the pad toward me. "I already do," I said. "Good." There was something in his face then, something beyond gratitude. Not fear exactly. Recognition, maybe, like he had finally accepted that the neatness of his household had always depended on unseen labor and that the wrong people were getting credit for it. I didn't know it then, but that was the start of the part he controlled. By August, the little signs started arranging themselves into a pattern I could no longer dismiss. A package from Carter Mobility arrived addressed to me because I had placed the order. Someone in the main house opened it before it reached the carriage house. Inside was a duplicate invoice stamped paid and a note from the company confirming the final balance. Celeste handed it to me at dinner and said, "I assumed it was something for Arthur. No apology. Just the clear fact that mail with my name on it no longer seemed to her like mine." A week later, Sloane referred to the carriage house as Mom's overflow suite in front of a neighbor, as though I were a long-term house guest instead of the person keeping her father alive and her mother free. Then I found out there was a family group thread called Wren Estate Timing, not Wren Family, not Dad Care. Wren Estate Timing. I only know because Brent accidentally forwarded me a screenshot when he meant to send me a grocery request. In the top bar, above his cropped message, I could see the thread title and a stack of muted notifications, Estate Timing. Those two words sat in my throat all afternoon. I told myself it could mean tax planning. Arthur had enough properties and old holdings that trusts and timing were not sinister by default. But the phrase lodged in me. It gave shape to a feeling I had been resisting, and that was when I realized none of this had started that week. It had been building for months, maybe longer. The little exclusions, the opened mail, the money questions during grief, the careful use of words like temporary and family and clarity. They had not been random irritations. They were rehearsal. Once I saw that, I started noticing everything. The gate code to the SID drive changed, and nobody told me until I got stuck outside at 9:30 p.m. with Arthur's evening prescription from the 24-hour pharmacy. Celeste began referring to Arthur's silver and artwork as things Sloane will sort later. While Arthur was still alive in the next room, a legal-size accordion folder disappeared from the library desk and reappeared 3 days later in a different drawer. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and found Celeste speaking in a low voice to a woman I didn't recognize. She introduced her as an appraiser and then smiled as if I were foolish for pausing. "Just preliminary insurance updates," she said. "Insurance updates. There are lies that rely on words. Then there are lies that rely on tone." Hers relied on tone. Arthur called me into the study that same evening. Martin Feld was there. I had met Martin twice before over general planning paperwork. He was in his late 60s, trim, careful, with the kind of dry voice that made even innocuous sentences sound already transcribed. He had one of those legal pads that older attorneys still prefer, with squared corners and a ruler-straight margin line. Arthur asked me to sit. Martin asked whether I had records of the amounts I had personally advanced for Arthur's care and for certain family-related obligations after Julian's death. The phrasing made me blink. "Yes," I said. "How complete?" Martin asked. "Very. Electronic copies?" "Yes." Arthur tapped the arm of his chair. "Send them to Martin." Celeste wasn't in the room. That mattered. I asked why. Arthur looked at the window for a moment before answering.